My name is Carolyn Marschner. I work at Cornell University in the Cornell Weed Ecology and Management Lab with Tony DiTommaso, who is a weed ecologist at Cornell. Our work focuses largely on New York and the Northeast. So with apologies, that is the centerpiece of my talk today, rather than a national perspective. As you guys have heard for a large part of yesterday, spring weather is getting strange. We're getting, especially in the Northeast, we're getting wetter springs. And the more unpredictable freeze dates are very unsettling for tree fruit producers and other fruit producers. But I'm going to focus on the aspect of wetter springs as it impacts annual crops, which is that it compresses people's planting timelines because you can't take equipment into fields that look like this. And then when you're planting everything at once, it makes it hard to get back and do your herbicide management, your weed management in a timely manner, either with herbicides or with more physical cultivation methods. And both of those require you getting into these fields and driving across them. And herbicides have a very specific needs for what weather that they are most effective in. So this is really impacting weed management during that critical window of early crop growth when competition can really change the direction, the trajectory of yield across the whole season. In the summertime, higher temperatures across the board, across the nation, and shifting rainfall patterns in the Northeast. We're seeing more intensive rainfall events and potentially more short-term droughts in between them, although that signal is less clear so far. But both of those impact weed stress because different crops are going to be competitive under those hotter, drier, or wetter conditions, and ditto for the crops themselves. If we think about this as the different ways that climate change can impact weed management. There's the direct weather impact that I just talked about. There's also range-shifting species, which you've already heard about yesterday, but I'll talk about more today. There's competition between the crops and the weeds and between the weeds themselves. And then management efficacy in a changing climate. And I'm going to focus in on herbicide efficacy a little later in the talk. So let's talk about range-shifting weeds. I am not the expert in this space. You have heard from the expert, and one of the two main experts in this space, which Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley have done amazing work on range-shifting species in the United States. Jacob Barney has done some work in agricultural weeds on this, especially in biofuels, looking at biofuels that can become weedy. And Dr. DiTommaso has done some work in range shifting and agricultural weeds as well. And there have been many others. There are many others across the world who are looking at how plants are moving with a changing climate. Jenica talked about this yesterday, but this was the first thing that I turned to when I was starting my 3-year project several years ago, trying to synthesize information on weed management in a changing climate. This is an amazing tool, this EdMaps range shifting tool. It's got over 100 species, maybe 180 species that were modeled for where they may be by about 2080. The gray here being where they are now, and the red being orange being where the climate will be suitable by 2080 for a given species, in this case, jungle rice, which I selected because, as you can see, it's not really in New York right now, but boy, will it ever be. These species were pulled from prohibited and regulated lists across the nation, I believe, and not from the noxious weed lists, because the focus of this work is really on invasive species in natural areas, which is it's amazing work, and it also doesn't necessarily capture all of the agricultural weeds, because a lot of our agricultural weeds are natives, like common ragweed or Palmer amaranth. Palmer amaranth being multiply herbicide resistant and the current bugbear of New York because it's recently arrived and we're trying to figure out how to deal with it. The bulk of these are presence absence modeling, which is important, but I think Jenica probably talked about yesterday. Abundance modeling is a better metric for whether a species is actually going to become a problem. So if you think about presence versus absence, here's the USDA plants database map for Johnson grass, which, as you can see, it's everywhere. But in fact, it's only really a problem weed in that southeastern portion of the United States. This is from McDonald 2009. This whole light gray area is where Johnson grass isn't really a problem. And then this area here is where it's really an issue. It has major impacts on yields. And then the darker colors are where it is likely to become a problem with climate change. So let's talk about changes in competitiveness. This is a big and complicated space. And one of the pieces of this that's really important is how a plant photosynthesizes. You may remember from your college biology, if you're not in the plant research space, that there are 3 different common ways for plants to make their food. They can use the C3, C4, or CAM methods. CAM is really very desert specific, so I'm not going to talk about it today. The C3 plants photosynthesize using an older method that's very well suited to temperate ecosystems. It's relatively inefficient at pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so when you increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the C3 plants get better at producing food for themselves, particularly in their optimal range of about 60 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The C4 plants are especially adapted more for hot and sometimes dry conditions. This is an adaptation that has evolved multiple times in many different plant families. It's a pretty efficient way of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, so the increase in CO2 does not benefit the C4 plants. Their optimum temperature is about 70 to 95 degrees. So let's think about how this will play out in relation to climate change. So here we are in our current climate. You've got a C3 plant, this happens to be common lamb's quarters on the left, and a C4 plant, which it happens to be a pigweed on the right. They're both growing the way that we expect them to grow. If you increase temperature, if you look at just higher temperatures, the C3 plants are not as adapted to those higher temperatures. They don't do as well, and the C4 plants really thrive because they have this adaptation that is in part to help them function better under high temperatures. If you look at just elevated CO2, those C3 plants are more likely to outcompete the C4 plants because they've got more CO2, they're making food for themselves more efficiently, and they're able to grow more quickly versus the C4 plants, which just don't benefit. What happens if you combine them? Now you have a larger C3 plant that has more resources to grow food, but is not particularly well adapted to those higher temperatures, and the C4 plants, which are not particularly benefited by the CO2, but do better under higher temperatures. And this one can fall out, which one is going to do better can depend on which particular species you're looking at. If you look at elevated CO2 and drought together, those C3 plants have more energy, but they're really not adapted to dry conditions. So they're not doing as well as they would under just elevated CO2 conditions. And the C4 plants are pretty well adapted to drought, so they're doing well. So in this case, probably the C4 plants would do better. In theory, if you have a flooded condition, the C3 plants do better. They're better adapted to moist conditions, but we don't actually know because there's not a lot of research in this space. Which is important because in the Northeast, we're seeing more rainfall, right? So for us, flooding is a more probable outcome for us in the changing climate. We're seeing more flooding events. And so we'd really like to know what's going on with flooding and competition. The abundance modeling subset in EdMaths is great for looking at competition. It's a smaller species set, but it's a better indicator of which species might become damaging in a given location. And so here's the if this is what the just presence absence map looks like for Johnson grass in the EdMaps tool. So you can see that it's expected to be present pretty much throughout the lower 48. But then if you look at the where it's likely to be competitive, it's much farther south. One of the species that we'd love to see more information on is burr cucumber. This is a species that is has a long emergence window, which means that its seeds are continuing to germinate throughout the summer. So you do your weed management in the spring, and then it just keeps emerging, which makes it hard to control in an agricultural setting. It's a vine, and it twines around your plants and makes it hard, physically difficult to harvest them, and can really impact yields. It's already present throughout the Northeast, but it's only a weed problem in the mid-Atlantic until recently. And now in New York, we're starting to see in the warmer parts of the state, in the river valleys, more and more reports of farmers saying, this is such a problem for us. We didn't used to have this problem with burr cucumber. So this is one that we anticipate will continue to become a problem in more northerly regions with climate change. Another one would be ivy leaf morning glory, which again is another vining plant that is a problematic in the mid-Atlantic and is present but not an issue in the Northeast, but we expect it to become more problematic. So changes in competitiveness is a complicated topic. There is a lot of research in this space, but there's a lot more room for more information. C3 versus C4 is a really important piece of the puzzle here. And different plants are responding differently to different climate factors. And so getting that more holistic view and layering the factors to get a better picture of what is likely to happen in a changing climate where we're seeing more erratic weather and lots of compounding factors is really important. Another useful thing to think about is changes in pest ranges for weeds. This particular weed here is velvet leaf. This one is a big problem in the north, but isn't so much in the mid-Atlantic or the south because there's a seed weevil there that keeps this plant from building up its populations to the point where it becomes a problem in farm fields. And we're starting to see that seed weevil more in our sampling in New York. So this is one situation where the plant range isn't what's changing, it's the controlling pest whose range is changing. The last topic I'm going to talk about is herbicide efficacy. We did a scoping review of this where we pulled together all of the literature that was relevant to dairy and field crop farmers in New York and to some extent the Northeast. And the factors that we found in the literature that were most important were what herbicide you're spraying, what species you're trying to control, and what climate factor. And there were really only three that are looked at extensively in the literature: temperature, CO2 concentration, and to a much lesser extent, droughts. So I'm just going to walk you through this one slide as an example of the kind of information that we found. This is the information that we found that's relevant for New York for glyphosate. This is the most commonly used herbicide in the world. So unsurprisingly, the bulk of the research was on this particular herbicide. So we've got C3 plants and C4 plants. We split them out by C3 and C4, thinking we might see a difference in signal there, given what I've told you about the competitiveness of the plants. And then you've got the different species that are common weeds in field crops in the Northeast here, and how their control changes with elevated CO2, elevated temperature, or drought. Red being their control is worse, blue being control is about the same, and the occasional green here being control was improved under, in these cases, higher temperatures. You see a lot of red and blue on this slide. This is all the glyphosate data. And glyphosate was the one herbicide that gave us a relatively clear signal throughout the literature that it is potentially not going to do as well under climate change. And given that it's the most commonly used herbicide in the world, and that it's there's a lot of herbicide-resistant biotypes developing, this is a message that's worth considering and sharing more widely. Now, the other slides that we did for these, there are several, for the other herbicides, there's just not as much information on those other herbicides, and so the signal is not as clear. But they were also all over the map. Some of them did better generally, some of them did generally worse, and a lot of them it just depended on what species you were spraying. So it's a much more complicated picture than I expected. When I started the scoping review, I had been looking at Lou Ziska's excellent work on glyphosate and its decreased efficacy on poison ivy and on Canada thistle. And so I was expecting a much more clear-cut picture. But what we found from the scoping review is that it's a pretty complicated story. It really depends on what chemistry you're looking at. They seem to each respond differently. The different species that are controlled are responding differently because of their changes in competitiveness, probably. And also, even different biotypes of a species will respond differently, with herbicide resistant and herbicide susceptible populations having opposite responses to herbicide control under different climate factors. It's a very interesting space. What we didn't see was a lot of information on herbicide efficacy in an increasingly wet climate, which again, in the Northeast, we realize this is not true across the country, but in the Northeast, this is really what we're looking at, is these wet springs when we're trying to do our weed management, and it's so wet. And there's just not a lot of information on what herbicides are going to do better or worse in those conditions. And that would be a really useful knowledge gap to fill. There's a little bit of information on combinations, high temperature and high CO2, high temperatures and drought, but not a lot. And again, since that's what our messy real world looks like, it would be nice to see some more research supported that would look at a more holistic view of what the future might look like with herbicide efficacy and management. So the knowledge gaps that we wanted to bring to this meeting that came out of this synthesis of information were, when you look at direct weather impacts, if you want to be able to continue to control weeds with these more unpredictable spring situations, precision weed management tools, alternative chemistries, and alternative management options like drone application or some end of season seed bank management might be tools that would make sense to incorporate into research. The competition literature, well over half of it is on grasslands, probably focused on pastures. There's not a lot of information on what's happening in cropping systems. There is some, but there's a lot of it is tropical. So more information on what's happening in the northern portion of the US with our field crops and vegetables and the weeds in them would be really helpful. And again, no information on waterlogging and wet conditions. For rain shifting, some abundance modeling for those agricultural weed species would be amazing. It would really help us get a clearer picture of what to expect and what to share with our growers. And some tools that would help with early detection of range shifting species is really needed, because it's hard to tell people to look for a weed that they're not familiar with because it doesn't grow there yet. And in the invasive species space, we have IMAP invasives and other really great geospatial tools that make it easy to see where things are moving. We don't have that in the agricultural space. And if there's a way to pull some of those amazing tools into the agricultural space, that would really help figure out, track any moving, range shifting agricultural weeds. For herbicide and management efficacy, developing some better knowledge on what alternatives might be to glyphosates and to herbicides generally for when you can't get into the field to apply them. Weather contingent management recommendations, weather dependent resistance screening for herbicide resistance under climate change conditions, and more information on waterlogging would be really helpful. And that is what I have to share with you today. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see faces. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to either answer them or find answers for them.
Thank you, Carolyn. You'll see faces, but they're all going to be a long distance away from you. So.
I know.
I'm curious, when you talk about early detection support, are you thinking about emergence models?
That's an interesting question. We've spent a lot of time working in our lab on weed emergence modeling in the Northeast. And I think that a decision support tool to help people track the emergence is really helpful. We've produced one. Other regions have their own that are better suited to their regions. What I was actually thinking on that slide was tools to help researchers and extensionists think about which species are going to be arriving, something like that range shifting listing for agricultural weeds, but also tools to help people develop a search image for those species that are likely to arrive, thinking more in the extension space there, so that people know what to look for. They know what kudzu looks like if they're in the path of kudzu. They know what how to differentiate between purple nutsedge and yellow nutsedge, so that they know to change their management as that arrives, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.